Dobrý den, vítejte u dalšího videa. Hello and welcome to my new video. A few of you have requested this topic and now it's here. In this video we will learn how to translate if into Czech. It's a little tricky because we could have 6 possibilities. Of course it all depends on the context, but technically we have these possibilities. Když or kdyby, jestli, pokud, zda, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and last one is li. Some of these connectors I already covered in my previous videos. I will make sure to post the links. So take a look at this. Když, kdyby, jestli, pokud, zda, li. This is quite a mess. But don't worry, I'll show you how we can use these. Sometimes you can use several of them without changing the meaning. Sometimes it wouldn't work, sometimes the meaning would slightly change. Let me give you an example with this movie. I'm sure many of you have seen this movie with Leonardo DiCaprio. Catch Me If You Can. That's the title in English. Catch Me If You Can. And we also have a dubbed version in Czech, of course, with a Czech title. And it's called Chyť mě, když to dokážeš. This is how the title is translated into Czech. Když meaning if. But we could also have different alternatives. We could also say chyť mě, jestli to dokážeš. That's another possibility. Chyť mě, pokud to dokážeš. And we could even say chyť mě, dokážeš-li to. With this li, but the word order would be different. Dokážeš-li to. That would come after the comma here. So you can see that we have 4 possibilities how to translate this sentence. The meaning would not change whatsoever. What would change is the way it sounds. If you ask me, I would say this one is the most natural one. This is what we would say with když. Když is very common for spoken Czech. Chyť mě, jestli to dokážeš also works, but the jestli sometimes work better for conditions. If something happens, then something else follows. Pokud is very formal. So here it doesn't sound like the best option unless you need it to sound formal, which doesn't work for this movie. And this one, dokážeš-li to, also sound formal. So these two are formal. Why can't we use zda? If all of them work, then we might as well use zda, right? No, zda is whether. So that one has a slightly different meaning. We will go through all of them. I'll give you some examples so you have an idea, and then we are going to translate some common phrases that you use in English and in Czech. So this is going to be quite a practical video. Let's get on with it. Jdeme na to. Ahoj, vítejte na mém kanále Czech by Zuzka, kde vám pomocí angličtiny vysvětluju českou gramatiku. Okay, let's start with když. Když is the most common of these 6 options because it has a lot of functions. Yes, we can translate it as if, but it often works as when or whenever. For example, když je zima, bolí mě koleno. When it's cold, my knee hurts. Meaning whenever it's cold, my knee hurts. We could add one word, vždycky, když je zima. Every time it's cold. Vždycky, když je zima, bolí mě koleno. This describes a fact. Když is used for general situations when you describe facts, or used in conditionals when you describe those real conditions. Když can involve condition, and it can be followed by the present tense or the future tense. Like here, this is the present tense. Když je zima. Every time it's cold. When it's cold, my knee hurts. What about this one? Když nestihneme tuhle tramvaj, pojedeme Uberem. Uberem. If we miss this tram, we will take an Uber. Když nestihneme. This is the future tense because stihnout, to make something, to catch something in time, is perfective, so it refers to the future. So this is if. If we don't catch this tram, then we'll take an Uber. So this is a condition. If, then. We can also use když in past tense. In that case, it would not mean if. It would be simply describing something that happened in a certain time period. Když byl Pepa malý, bál se tmy. When Peppa was small, he was afraid of the dark. Když byl Peppa malý. When. So, když works as if we describe a condition. It can be talking about a fact, followed by the present tense, or the possibility that will come if something happens, which would be used with the future tense. Now, když is not typically followed by the conditional. In proper Czech, it should not be followed by the conditional. If you want to talk about hypothetical situations, you should use the next one that I'm going to show you, and that is kdyby. Kdyby. But what sometimes happens in colloquial Czech, sometimes people would say když by, which technically is incorrect, but it's colloquial Czech. In proper Czech, když by should be replaced by kdyby. So remember, když should not be followed by the conditional form. So this is když for you. Když is the most common of them, as I said, because it has more functions and also it is informal. We often use it in spoken Czech. Now it's time for kdyby. Kdyby translates to if. And it refers to hypothetical situations. We use it in conditionals, those unreal conditions that could happen. Hypothetical ones. Kdybych měla peníze, jela bych k moři. Here is not kdyby. It's also important to mention that it's not only about kdyby. It can have different forms depending on what it refers to. Kdybych means kdyby plus já. So that would be kdybych já. So this is not the only form. I also made a video about this. We can have kdybych, kdybys, kdyby, kdybychom, or kdybysme, and kdybyste. If I had money, I would go to the sea. Kdybych měla peníze, jela bych k moři. So here, as it's a conditional, a third conditional, we are using conditional form in both parts of the sentence. However, it's not the requirement. We can also have a so-called mixed conditional. That means we can have different tense in the other part of the sentence, like here. Zavolej mi, kdybys něco potřeboval. Call me if you need anything, if you needed anything, literally. Here, there is no conditional form. This is actually a command, an imperative. Zavolej mi, call me. Call me if you need anything. Both these sentences translate to if, kdybych, kdybys, ty, and it talks about hypothetical if. When we use kdyby or kdybych and all these forms, it has to be followed by the conditional form. You can see that we have a kdy plus bys in this case, which is part of the conditional form, and then the rest is the past tense. So this is how we form the conditional form. Potřeboval bys. A kdybys něco potřeboval. If you needed anything. There is a video about this. There are more videos about this topic. Pokud. Pokud translates to if. And it involves a condition. And careful, pokud is formal. It's not so common to hear it in spoken Czech. It sounds formal. Pokud máte čas, můžete jít se mnou. Pokud máte čas, if you have time, you can go with me. So, if. Missing a kroužek here. Můžete. Pokud nám bude přát počasí, půjdeme k jezeru. This is a very nice, proper phrase. It's a little formal, of course, but it's really nice to use it if you find the right context. If the weather permits, we will go to the lake. Pokud nám bude přát počasí, which literally means if the weather wishes well, if the weather wishes to us. That's the literal translation. If the weather permits. And it's also typical in phrases such as this one. Pokud možno. If possible. Pokud možno. This is a formal phrase which you can use if you ask someone for a deadline, for example. Potřebuju to pokud možno do úterý. I need it by Tuesday if possible. Or you could say pokud možno co nejdřív, which is something like as soon as possible, if possible. Pokud možno. Formal but very useful phrase. Now, is this the only thing that we can use here? What if we wanted to say když? Can we do that? Když máte čas. Oh, if we say když máte čas, that doesn't work as if. It would just not make sense. What we could do, if we want to use když, we would have to use future tense. Máte here is in the present. But you could say, když budete mít čas, můžete jít se mnou. That would work. We could also do it here and we don't have to change anything because this is already in the future tense. We could also say, když nám bude přát počasí, and it would mean the same thing, except this one would sound less formal. Pokud nám bude přát počasí, that's formal. Když nám bude přát počasí, that's more informal or neutral. Když možno doesn't exist. Next word is going to be jestli, and I am going to tell you right now that it would work here as well in these two sentences. Jestli máte čas, jestli nám bude přát počasí. And we would not have to change the tense because jestli can be followed also by the present tense or the future, and it would also be less formal. This is what I want you to remember from this board. Pokud means if, we talk about a condition, but it's formal. So if you speak, try to limit using this because you would sound too formal. Also, good to know, pokud can be used with the conditional form as well. So for example, those sentences that I showed you with kdyby or kdybych could work with pokud if you want them to sound more formal. For example, zavolej mi, pokud bys něco potřeboval. That works. It's just formal. Now it's time for jestli. Jestli translates to if or whether, but it's informal. Jestli is used for real conditions. It's typical to use it with this verb. Jestli chceš, if you want. Jestli chceš, můžeš jít se mnou. If you want, you can go with me or come with me. Here we could also say pokud. Just like in the previous slide, you could say pokud chceš, můžeš jít se mnou. That would be formal. Jestli chceš would be informal. You cannot replace jestli by když if you want to talk about those facts. Like, remember, když prší, tak mě bolí koleno. You cannot say jestli prší because jestli talks about a condition. So if, and another meaning is whether. Whether something is true or not. Whether yes or no. So this is typical in indirect questions. Nevím, jestli přijde. I don't know if, or I don't know whether he or she will come. Nevím, jestli přijde. So this is if meaning whether. Nevím, jestli přijde. Here we cannot replace it by pokud because pokud doesn't work as whether. What we can do is we can replace this particular sentence with zda, which is something that I will show you in a minute. Zda means whether, but the difference is zda is formal. So jestli and zda are very similar because they can both mean whether, but zda is formal, jestli is informal. Okay, number 5, zda. Zda is easy because it means whether. Sometimes we translate it as if, but it only expresses indirect questions, whether yes or no. What I want you to remember is that it's formal, just like pokud. Remember, pokud and zda, these are formal words. And we have informal equivalents for that. Zda also has even a more formal equivalent, that is zdali. Less formal equivalent would be jestli. But remember, they are not always interchangeable because jestli has a broader meaning. Jestli can work as if in conditions, but zda is limited only to whether yes or no, in indirect questions. For example, nevím zda, or if you want to sound super formal, you could say zdali. Nevím zda to bude nutné. I don't know whether it's going to be necessary. Informally, you could also say if that's going to be necessary, but once you use zda, it also makes sense to translate it with whether. Nevím, zda to bude nutné. This is a formal sentence. If you don't want it to sound too formal, you can simply say jestli, and that works perfectly here. Nevím, jestli to bude nutné. I don't know if that's going to be necessary. Can we replace it with anything else? Can we say když? No. Kdyby? No. Pokud? No, because these three don't work as whether. Now, this sentence. Zeptal jsem se ho, zda mu to nevadí. I asked him whether he minded, whether he was okay with it. Again, zda makes it sound formal. We could also say jestli. Zeptal jsem se ho, jestli mu to nevadí, which makes it sound neutral or informal. Remember these two things. Zda or zdali are formal. They mean whether, and we can replace them by jestli if we want it to sound less formal. Also keep in mind that zda is spelled without any accent is not the same as this one. If you see this one, it would probably have said somewhere in the sentence, zdá se mi, for example, which means I have a feeling, or I feel, or I dream. So that's zdát se, to have a feeling. This is zda, this is whether. And now finally, our last one, li, which I covered in a video earlier this year, I think. We can translate li as if, sometimes as whether, but that's very formal. Both of them are used in a very formal context, in official context often. This is not typical for spoken Czech, not anymore. And one thing to keep in mind is there is always verb before li. There is a dash li. For example, it's typical with these verbs. Chcete-li, if you want. Je-li, if it is. Má-li, if it has. For example, pomohu vám, chcete-li. I'll help you if you want or if you wish. That is very formal. I even used pomohu, this special formal form of the verb pomoct. So if you want. It's a very interesting way to use this word, that it's after the verb with a dash. I recommend you to watch the video that I made before because I give plenty more examples. Budete-li cvičit, zlepší se vaše kondice. If you will do exercise, your fitness will improve. Budete-li, if you do exercise. It could also work as whether, but that's very, very formal. For example, instead of zda, you could go one more level of formality. Nevím, bude-li to nutné. Bude-li, if necessary. So 3 of these words were formal. Remember, pokud, jestli, and li. Now it's time to practice. Imagine this situation. You see someone doing a handstand and you think, I could never do this. And that person tells you, well, you would be able to do it if you practiced, like me. Dokázal bys to, kdybys trénoval, if you practiced. Instead of kdybys, you could also say pokud, if you need it to sound formal. Pokud bys trénoval. Actually, it sounds better if you say kdybys to trénoval, if you practice that. We can also get rid of this hypothetical feeling. We could say, dokážeš to, když to budeš trénovat. So we would have a future tense here. And it makes it sound more approachable, more real. Dokážeš to, když to budeš trénovat. So here we have když. And we could also say jestli, jestli to budeš trénovat. Once you use jestli, it's suddenly a little bit more distant, because jestli again emphasizes that condition. Jestli to budeš trénovat. Here we could say pokud as well, and that would be formal again, because pokud is just formal. But it's fine with future tense. It doesn't have to have conditional form here. We cannot use zda. Zda is just not working here because this is not about whether you can do it or not. This is a condition that if you practice it. We can use li, but that would be ridiculously formal. But I mean, why not? Budeš-li to trénovat? Budeš-li to trénovat? That would sound formal, or going back 70 years maybe or more. So this is how we can use these connectors in different situations. Now let's look at the phrases that we commonly use with if in English and how we say that in Czech. Okay, so these phrases are taken out of context, so we will have lots of possibilities. All these phrases are very common in everyday speech, so this will be very useful. We often say, what if? Well, what if this is not true? What if this happens? We have 2 possibilities. We could say, co když? Co když? If this is something more approachable, more probable. A co když to není pravda? And what if this is not true? Or you could say, and what if this wasn't true? It could be more distant, more hypothetical. In that case, it would be co kdyby. So it all depends on the context. If I were you, kdybych byl or byla, of course, tebou, or kdybych byla na tvém místě, I'm not going to get into these possible translations. I want to focus on the if part. Kdybych byla tebou. If you say so. Když to říkáš, of course you could say říkáte as well if it's talking to more people or you address someone formally. Or you could say když myslíš. Když myslíš, or no, když myslíš. If you say so. So notice in Czech we actually say if you think so. If you insist is really nice. Když na tom trváš, or když jinak nedáš. Když jinak nedáš. This second one is more informal. If you don't give otherwise, that's the literal translation. No, když jinak nedáš, když na tom trváš. If you insist. So could we say something else here instead of když? Pokud to říkáš, it works but sounds too formal. Jestli gives it a condition, so I would not use that either. Zda doesn't work, říkáš-li to also doesn't work. And kdyby makes it hypothetical, so that doesn't work. What about here? Když na tom trváš, pokud na tom trváš, again, works but too formal. Trváš-li na tom, also very formal, but possible. What about this one? If I'm not mistaken, this is a formal phrase. It can be used formally. Let's start with something less formal. You could just simply say, jestli se nepletu. This is something that you would use in everyday language. Jestli se nepletu, which means if I'm not mistaken, if I'm not wrong, jestli se nepletu. Or you could say pokud, but that adds a little bit more towards the formal language. Pokud se nepletu. Když se nepletu doesn't work because that would change the meaning. That would mean since I'm not mistaken, you would assume that you are right. That would change the meaning of this phrase. Now, if we need a formal phrase, we could also use a different verb, which is mýlit se, to be wrong. It's a very interesting verb. It would be very formally, nemýlím-li se. Very, very formal. Super formal. Nemýlím-li se, if I'm not mistaken. Or you could also say pokud se nemýlím. So if I were to grade the degree of formality, remember one time I did it in one video. Let's say 1 would be the most formal one and 5 would be informal. So I would say, jestli se nepletu is 5, that's informal. Or neutral, let's say, but compared to all these, it's the most informal one. Then pokud se nepletu, pokud is formal, but nepletu se, this verb is kind of informal. Then nemýlím-li se, on the other hand, is super formal. I'll give it 1. Pokud se nemýlím would be something like 2 or 3. Now this one. Let me know if anything happens. Dej mi vědět, kdyby se něco stalo. Dej mi vědět, kdyby, because we talk about condition. Kdyby se něco stalo. This is literally if something happened, but in Czech also we like to say this phrase, kdyby něco, if anything. So this is a really nice one to remember. Kdyby něco, if anything. We can even use it here. Dej mi vědět, kdyby něco. Zavolej mi, kdyby něco. And there is nothing else, no other verb. And finally, there is an exercise for you. Your task is to take a look at these 6 sentences and translate the remaining parts. Your task is to focus on the if part. How do you translate those parts? You have several options. Pause the video and think about this. Remember, you have 6 words that you can use. Když, kdyby, jestli, pokud, zda and li. Go. Jdeme na to, jdeme to zkontrolovat. Číslo 1. I'll take a picture of it if you don't mind. Vyfotím si to, pokud ti to nevadí. That's formal. Jestli ti to nevadí. That's less formal. Anything else? No. If you say když ti to nevadí, it would change the meaning. That would mean since you don't mind. It's a fact that you don't mind it. Číslo 2. If all goes well, we'll be home before midnight. Když všechno půjde dobře, budeme doma před půlnocí. Or pokud všechno půjde dobře. So, když in this case is more informal or neutral, pokud is more formal. Can we say jestli? We can. Jestli would be something in the middle. Když is a little bit more conversational. And what about li? Can we say půjde-li všechno dobře? We can do that too. It would be very, very formal. Číslo 3. If I remember correctly, you never liked Czech cuisine. Jestli si to dobře pamatuju, nikdy ti nechutnala česká kuchyně. Nebo pokud si to dobře pamatuju. Pokud is more formal. Pamatuju-li si to dobře, very, very formal. Not really used. Číslo 4. If that's the case, I'd be happy to help you with that. Jestli je to tak, rád ti pomůžu. Ráda ti pomůžu. We could say pokud je to tak. Jestli is more informal, pokud is formal. We could say also když je to tak. There would be a difference because když would say this is already the case. And if you say jestli or pokud, it stresses the condition. You're not so sure that this is the case. So jestli and pokud are a little bit hypothetical. And if you use když and present tense here, it means since it's like that. But we can use all three of them. Číslo 5. Take a look and tell me if you like it. Podívej se na to a řekni mi, jestli se ti to líbí. Jestli, or again, you can say pokud se ti to líbí. We can use jestli, which would be informal or neutral at least. You could use zda, and that would be formal. Zda se ti to líbí. Or you could say líbí-li se ti to, and that would be extremely formal and bookish. Číslo 6. I'll go there myself if it's necessary. Půjdu tam já osobně, pokud to bude nutné. That would be formal. Jestli to bude nutné, less formal. Když to bude nutné, could also work. That would also be informal. Or if you need to be formal, you could say bude-li to nutné. So, this is all. This is it. It's not an easy topic. I understand some of these words can work together and it's not very clear which is a synonym, but what I want you to remember is that zda, pokud and li are formal words. Zda and jestli mean whether as well. Li also works as whether, but super formal. And some of these can be interchangeable. That's all from me. Let me know if this was helpful. Feel free to drop a comment, write more examples. Děkuji, že jste se dívali a uvidíme se za týden. Ciao.